you for having us here to go through a real kind of overview of redistricting. And as you'll see in this presentation, I'm going to actually reference back to some of the prior presentations that you've had to try to kind of connect the dots on a lot of this. If we can go to the next slide. The things that I'll be covering, just an overview of what redistricting is, the state and federal Voting Rights Act issues, what is gerrymandering. I'll even get into how you pronounce gerrymandering or gerrymandering, traditional redistricting principles, the census data, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about, and I'll be talking about it as you saw in that maptitude, the little boxes with little numbers in them and what that all means. I'll be talking a little bit about public input, and then finally some ideas on methods for line drawing rather than just the technical aspects, but how will most commissions do this in practice? Next. Oh, next. So at the heart of it, redistricting is rebalancing. It is making sure that all districts are of equal size so that everybody has one of two things or both of two things: equal representation, which is the idea that if Connie and I live in different parts of the city and Connie has a pothole and I have a pothole, that we both have equal access to elected officials that can help us, and that ability to have equal representation when we're participating in government and when we have needs from government. And then the second is one person, one vote, the idea that both mine and Connie's votes matter equally in an election. And there can be real imbalances in areas that have districted elections. I actually did a redistricting in Santa Barbara where one district had 100,000 people in it and one district had 12,000 people in it. And as you could think about it, that 12,000 person district, each of the people in that district, their vote actually counted 8 times more than the vote of the person in the 100,000 person district. And if you were living in the 100,000 person district, you would have to get the equivalent of 8 of your friends together to all complain about a pothole to have the same voice and try to get the same respect from your elected officials. Next. Redistricting has changed a lot. In the last several years, especially in the last decade, we've seen a lot of changes, largely from 3 things happening in federal law. The elimination of parts of the Voting Rights Act. Essentially, there was, and I'll get into it, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was not eliminated, but the authority to use it was essentially eliminated. Supreme Court decisions, and if you have questions about specific Supreme Court decisions, we'll defer to your city attorney to describe some of those legal things, but I'll get into some of the broad strokes. And then H.R. 1 is a bill currently in Congress that would also be a federal law change to how redistricting is done. And it would probably, if passed, require all states to use a commission process like what the state of California had, among other changes. Next. In California and in municipal law, we had Prop 11 and 20, which established statewide redistricting, set those rules and expanded it to Congress. The California Fair Maps Act, being all in caps is not a mistake. It actually is a acronym. But the Fair Maps Act is what will help guide our process. In addition to your charter, you're going to have to follow elements of the Fair Maps Act that has to do with county and city redistricting. And then your charter, Long Beach Charter Amendment DD. Next. Now, this is my first kind of flashback slide, but in the presentation we had with Kathy Fung, remember, we discussed a lot about the history of this reform in California and what it has actually meant in a practical sense, not just in a policymaking sense, and the ability for these reforms to help communities become unified in districting plans, to take the power away from incumbents, to try to eliminate the gerrymandering that has weakened voter strength. Next slide. The last thing, it's not a policy thing, it's not a law, it's not a Supreme Court decision, but it's literally the public's attitude towards redistricting has changed dramatically in the last decade. We actually were involved with some polling. 97% of voters agree that local government should be required to have open, transparent redistricting. Now, in today's politics, you can hardly get 97% of voters to agree that the sky is blue, but they definitely do not like gerrymandering and believe in the process that you're doing. The other thing is the media has taken a larger role in trying to undo that gerrymandering, to expose issues in redistricting. When we first started doing some work more than a decade ago, we look back and historically you'd see very, very few articles written about redistricting. There were probably less than 10 full-throated articles about redistricting in the 2000 cycle. There have been 10 full-throated articles about redistricting this week. So there's been a massive change in the media's attention to this issue, and that helps promote and ensure that those reforms that are happening at the courts and in our state and local laws are actually being followed through on. Next. State and Federal Voting Rights Act. Next. This is a second flashback, but we had great presentations from Justin Levitt and Myrna Perez discussing those federal laws, and you can go back to those presentations, which are still available on the redistricting website. So if a member of the community doesn't know what these presentations are, they're available and they'd be great for anybody to go back and see. Next. A lot of what they discussed was the Federal Voting Rights Act. The two provisions of the Federal Voting Rights Act that most involve redistricting are, first off, Section 2, which most people commonly understand as being the part of the Voting Rights Act that in some cases require majority-minority districts, and Section 5, which requires pre-clearance of any election law to ensure that that law is not being used to dilute the voting power of protected classes. Now, the pre-clearance is currently inactive because the Supreme Court invalidated Section 4, which was the part of law that said what entities are in Section 5. So Section 5 still exists. It's just that no entities right now are under Section 5. This is something that we might see changes to from Congress in the coming years. The California Voting Rights Act sounds like it should be really relevant to what we're doing, but it's not. The California Voting Rights Act is a very specific act. It essentially disallows the use of at-large elections. Like you might have experienced an election where they say, vote for 2 or vote for 3. Those are generally at-large elections, and they're not allowed in California when an agency has an underlying pattern of racially polarized voting. You're in districts in Long Beach, so we're never going to have a situation where somebody says, does this or that violate the California Voting Rights Act in the work we're going to be doing? Next. Now let's dive into Section 2 a little bit. And again, the earlier presentations highlighted this. And again, I'll make the same statement that Justin Levitt made, which is that I'm not your attorney, but I'm going to talk about these in a policy construct. So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act doesn't just require you create majority-minority districts anywhere you can. It actually requires that you create a majority-minority district when there are certain criteria met. So a minority group, first off, needs to be large enough that it can be comprised in a district and actually make up 50% or more of that district. That community also has to be politically cohesive. You can imagine if you created a majority-minority district, but within that majority-minority district, there were pockets of those voters that were all voting different ways, it wouldn't be effective at creating any kind of unified voting opportunity for that community. So it needs to be cohesive. And in the district without the majority-minority implementation, there has to be some majority of voters that would work as a block to defeat that minority group's preferred candidate. So you have to have a population that's large enough, that is cohesive enough, and that if it doesn't have the protection of the majority-minority district, would have its votes diluted by a majority population. So, next slide. So when we are in a situation, if we are, we'll find out as we go through this process, but if any agency in the US is involved in this situation, there are a number of questions that need to be asked of your legal counsel to determine whether or not Section 2 is invoked. So first off, does the minority population qualify? Is the creation of a district that would be majority-minority an effective tool at remedying it? And in some cases in Los Angeles County, as an example, they would draw majority-minority districts, but they would draw them at 55% Latino or 58% Latino, because they would say the lower voting turnout from this population, because so many of those voters are younger or lower socioeconomic or just lower voter turnout historically, they need to have a higher than 50% majority in order for that majority-minority status to actually effectuate the opportunity for that community to elect a candidate of choice. A third is, there might be instances where somebody would say, well, we need to have a coalition majority-minority district. And that can be when two or more minority populations can also meet this criteria because they vote cohesively and can be drawn in a way to affect the outcome of a race. Without Section 2 being implemented, you can still draw districts that say support a community of interest, where there are a number of factors beyond race that are also helping that community of interest stay whole, but race cannot be the predominant factor in drawing that district. So we might find ourselves in a situation where somebody says, well, there is this area of the city where we want to draw a district that would, represent a community, but we might not be able to put it in race terms unless we have the guidance from your attorney that Section 2 has been implemented, and now we can talk about it more in regards to its racial composition. Next. So what is gerrymandering? When you are in high school, you see this political cartoon. It was a salamander, dragon kind of thing, and it was this weird shaped district in state Senate races drawn by Governor Elbridge Gerry. And I remember in 2011 listening to the statewide redistricting commission, and Connie would pronounce it gerrymandering or a gerrymander. And it was back and forth with commissioners as to how they would pronounce it. So gerrymander or gerrymander, I say it's just like GIF or JIF. You can use either. But this is the old-timey thing, right? This is something you would expect. That doesn't happen anymore. Next. That used to be a state Senate district in LA. It looks just like the gerrymander to me. It's got a head, it's got wings, it's got little talons at the bottom, but it also effectively, it was a district that went all the way down into LA, into some of the most urban, heavily Latino LA populations, and then all the way up to South Pasadena and San Marino. So you can't, I don't think, make a really strong, community of interest argument for San Marino and, downtown LA. But this was an actual district that was drawn in the 2001 redistricting. It was a Senate district that was, that whole plan was part of the impetus for creation of the statewide redistricting commission. Next. Now, if you went to, in college, you came back to the idea of gerrymandering, you might see something that looks like this. It's a little exercise to show what is gerrymandering and what's its effect. And if I gave everybody a little placard with this and gave them a pen and said, okay, you've got 5 seconds, draw 3 districts, most people would draw this. Next. Something like that, or maybe vertical circles and so on. But somebody who maybe was really into Team Green might draw this. Next one. Now what I've done is I've taken that same population and I've maximized the voting power of the green and disadvantaged the voting strength of the yellow. Now, if we go to next, most of the time, people think about this as partisan gerrymandering, that Democrats and Republicans, and this does happen nationally, are working to advantage their political party and using gerrymandering as a way to achieve that. The courts, unfortunately, have found that it's non-justiciable, meaning that they do not believe that the courts can actually get in the game of kind of calling balls and strikes and figuring out this is a partisan gerrymander, that's not a partisan gerrymander. So they basically have thrown their arms up and said, we don't know, just we're not going to enforce at the Supreme Court level any violations of partisan gerrymandering. Now, as we'll get into later, you're not allowed as a commission to look at partisanship, but I have to say in all my local redistrictings, I rarely, if ever, hear anything about partisanship. There are other issues. Racial gerrymandering is something the courts have repeatedly found is unlawful, and the courts have been very willing to go in and undo racial gerrymandering. There are some people who are concerned that in this redistricting, that in some states, groups will draw districts as racial gerrymanders, but they'll say, oh, we were just doing it to put the Democrats in one district. So there might be some interesting Supreme Court cases in the coming years over this idea of racial gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering, because oftentimes they will result in very similar looking districts. Way more common than those other two is incumbent gerrymandering. And this is very common, especially in jurisdictions where it's the jurisdiction themselves drawing the lines. And it has essentially been outlawed for cities and counties in California, because now cities and counties cannot consider the residents of an incumbent or a candidate as a community of interest. And we'll get into that on your measure DDD as well. But incumbent gerrymandering is something that is also very real. There are a couple other ways of wording that. Some people call it like a handshake gerrymander, where in the legislature, the Democrats and Republicans would have a little handshake deal where they would protect the Democrats would protect the Republican districts in exchange for votes on the budget or exchange for something else. Next slide. So the next thing I'm going to get into is traditional redistricting principles. Now, I'll tie these back to your actual rules, but I want to kind of step back and think about these in the context of all redistricting to kind of set the stage a little bit first. So the first principle is next, that all districts should be relatively equal sized. And that's by people, not by citizens or voters or some other criteria. Next. So the idea is that we need to maintain this equality in order for districts to be effective at allowing individuals who live, no matter where they live in the city, in this example, to have an equal voice. When districts aren't perfectly equal, we call that a deviation. It means that if the average district is 10,000, in a district, you have a city with 50,000 people, and there's 5 districts, each district is 10,000, the population difference from that exact 10,000 is called the deviation. Next. In Congress, the allowable deviation is 1 person. And this gets a little bit kind of ludicrous at some points, because the census itself is so flawed in places that, you know, it's a little bit of fiction that these districts are perfectly equal. And oftentimes drawing districts to be equal by 1 person necessitates somebody literally going and finding a census block with 3 people and replacing it with a census block with 2 people, just trying to get to that mathematical 1 person. There are places that don't do 1 person deviation, but in California we do. Local government generally has a 10% deviation. That's what's allowable. And we'll look at that in the future as regards to the city of Long Beach. But in that situation where you had 10,000 people per district, That means that the largest district and the smallest district, when you look at the difference, can't be more than 10%. And when you receive your redistricting manual, we give some examples of that so that you can dive into that a little more. Now, the legislative districts or other districts, sometimes they go back and forth with what their deviations are going to be. I don't know if Connie remembers off the top of her head the decision that the commission made for state legislative lines, but it might have been 2% or something like that for legislative districts. And it's not uncommon for agencies to set a goal for what they want to have as be that deviation range that they're going to find acceptable. Next. So what I think is important as you're going to think about this is that the equality is required, but strictly adhering to some numeric value beyond what is required is not necessarily better. I feel like in redistricting, a lot of agencies where I do a city council redistricting or a school board redistricting, they fall into a trap. And they say, well, we want a really good redistricting, so we're going to do a 1% deviation. And then if you make that decision at the outset, before you actually get through the redistricting process, you might find that in a 2% deviation, you could keep a neighborhood whole, but we've already made a decision, we're going to do 1% deviation. And so that higher criteria of keeping a neighborhood whole becomes secondary to some artificial criteria that the commission makes to set some deviation standard that's more strict. So I think as you go through this process, you have certain criteria that I'll go through that you're supposed to follow, but don't fall into a trap of doing this thing that seems really easy to translate to, to communicate to voters. You say, hey, we're doing a districting, we're only having a 1% deviation, but that doesn't mean necessarily that it's better than a plan that has a 5% deviation, but also can create maybe better districts. Next. Contiguous is the next criteria that's a standard criteria and is a criteria for you, but it's also criteria that has some subtlety within it. Next. So what is contiguous? It seems pretty obvious. Contiguous is a whole piece. If you have something that's whole and it doesn't have any broken away parts, that's contiguous. And there are lots of areas that are literally contiguous, but then there's also this secondary criteria to think about that's termed functionally contiguous, meaning not just is it contiguous in its reality, like literally, but is it contiguous in its function? So next. So two types of functionally contiguous. An area can be not literally contiguous, but be functionally contiguous. Catalina Island is not literally contiguous to LA County, but functionally it is in LA County. So if we were drawing lines for LA County, we would put Catalina Island in a district and probably make it associated with San Pedro or Long Beach because that's where the ferries go to Catalina. So you'd say, well, Catalina is functionally contiguous to that part of the coastline, but it's not functionally contiguous to Malibu because you can't get from Catalina to Malibu unless you take a helicopter. The other side of the coin is things that are literally contiguous, but not functionally contiguous. If me and Connie live on either sides of a freeway and to get to each other's houses, we have to drive a mile down, go under an underpass, come back, go out of a city, back into a city, get off a freeway, and then we're at the other person's house. Yeah, like our houses look from a map like they're literally contiguous, but in terms of function, they might not be actually literally contiguous. So they're not be functionally contiguous. So this happens a lot. Like think about outside of Long Beach. Is Glendale and La Cañada contiguous to Palmdale? Well, not really. You could draw a circle that would include Glendale, La Cañada, the Angeles Crest, Mount Wilson, Palmdale. But to get to Palmdale, nobody's going to do that. They're going to go out and around on the 5 and go back into Palmdale the other way. And so it's not It could be literally contiguous, but not functionally contiguous. Next. Following communities of interest. Next. Now, again, another flashback. We had great presentations from Master Ochoa and from Dr. John Dobard regarding this. So if you're watching this online, go back and look for those presentations. I just looked at them. They're on the website, so you can go anytime and dive into these topics there. The communities of interest that we have obviously talked about next. We've already talked about communities of interest, including ethnic, language minorities, and others that we talk about in the Voting Rights Act issues. But there are other and many other communities of interest that are in the city of Long Beach and can be involved in redistricting. One large one, and that it's a community that we work with, is the LGBTQ community and their community of interest. In fact, if you were to look at the criteria around what types of ethnic groups can fall under the Voting Rights Act, and you try to apply those to the LGBTQ community, it's pretty similar. Senior citizens and students can be another community of interest. The urban downtown community versus a rural or suburban area, all of these can be communities of interest. Even on this commission, I've heard members of the commission talk about socioeconomics, renters versus homeowners. So a lot of those are the kind of communities of interest. Now, next slide. This is something that came up in, I believe, Astrid's presentation, and one of the questions that came from a commissioner. And it was about how do you judge different communities of interest, and what information do you want from a community of interest to really translate, like, we understand who you are, but how do you apply to a mapping exercise that we're going to be doing? So the three things that I would suggest, and there's probably more, but these are three things that really come up a lot in terms of helping any agency or a commission understand how to relate these communities of interest to redistricting is, first off, is this a group with a shared culture characteristics? That could be that they're in the same workforce, they could be in the same religious group, they could, love all the same dog parks. There's that dog cat exercise that Astrid did. That's the idea of, do you have this shared community that you're a part of? But since we're talking about mapping, we really also want to know, what's the geographic nature of that? Is there a density of that population? And is it a community that's able to be mapped? Some instances, they might be able to be mapped and it's a data source that we already have because of the census. In other instances, it might be an area, a group that, like I'll talk about in a little bit, the CLCV, the League of Conservation Voters, says, well, our community of interest is people who hear airplane noise and people who deal with transportation issues. And so there might be some things outside of the census data in order to help define that and map it. And the third is relationship to the agencies and the policies that are undertaken by the agency being districted. So we did a redistricting in Solano County for a water district. And I kid you not, we had to map walnut growers and almond growers. So that was a community of interest because of the different water needs from that part of agriculture versus other parts of agriculture in a water district redistricting. I do not believe you're going to be dealing with elevation tables, water rates, and almond growers and walnut growers in a citywide redistricting. But you might be dealing with city services, transportation issues, potholes, sidewalks, parks, a lot of other things that have to do with the relationship between that community of interest and their city government. Next. Following existing neighborhoods. Next. This is probably the most explicit part of your responsibility in the Fair Maps Act and Measure DDD, that you are to, under both laws, do the best you can to reduce the number of neighborhood splits and try to maintain the geographic integrity of neighborhoods. Next. So this gets to a part of the process that you'll have to be engaged in with city staff, and there will have to be some early mapping exercises to help understand this, and that is, what are your neighborhoods? So we need to do work to define the neighborhoods because this map is a map that the city has of the neighborhoods, but it might not be the only map and it might not be the final map. Next slide. So we need to undertake a process, and we've started with doing a little memo for the city staff, and we'll work with you, and maybe there's some need to bring this to the commission sometime soon. But we need to do some identifying of what are the neighborhoods and defining them, geographically defining them. We also have to deal sometimes with what competing ideas of neighborhoods might be. There might be one area that is called neighborhood Spar Heights, which is a neighborhood I grew up in. And other people might say, no, that's not Spar Heights, that's actually Montrose. And so there is some kind of sometimes competing ideas around what neighborhood boundaries are. And then finally, you're required to do your redistricting in census geographies. And I'll get more into what that means. But the census geographies don't always follow all the neighborhood boundaries. So if a neighborhood boundary and a census geography don't perfectly align, we're going to have to do some work to say, okay, let's convert these neighborhoods to the census geography. Next. So then, keeping districts compact. So this was something that Justin Levitt mentioned in his presentation, and he went into this idea that I thought was really easy to understand, that there are measures for what is compact. Largely, the most compact shape in science is a sphere. And so things that are more sphere-like, more box-like, more complete like that is more compact. Things that have more squiggly shapes and lines, that's generally less compact. That is kind of a mathematical thing, and there are different tests of it. A lot of the software will have dozens of different tests that you can use. In fact, in one state that we're helping some advocates in, they actually have language that says you can't have funny shapes. That's their rule for compactness. Next slide. So in California, again, as Justin Levitt mentioned in his presentation, we have this, what I believe is a rather elegant definition. It's rather simple. It takes a little moment to understand it the first time. But the idea is that as you're drawing a district, you're not bypassing nearby population in favor of further away population. So the idea is to favor other nearby populations. Now, this is a test, and as we talk about this in a minute, you'll see it's not the only test, it's not the number one test, but it is just one of the tests. And if Federal Voting Rights Act necessitates drawing a district that's less compact, you're going to draw a less compact district. If preserving neighborhoods necessitates drawing a district that isn't exactly as compact, or drawing districts of equal size necessitates that sometimes, those are trade-offs. But largely, the idea is to draw districts where you're unifying nearby populations and not favoring a far away population and bypassing a nearby one. So I'm going to show some actual cities in California. I won't call them out, but next slide. This is a city in Northern California, and I want to draw your eye to the red district. Next slide. We have a neighborhood down here, an area in the southeastern corner. Next slide. To my eye, the nearby populations are B and C. They're on one side of the freeway, they're all nearby each other. If you look at the streets and how they're laid out, they all kind of intersect with each other. So in my eye, these are the nearby populations. Next slide. But look at D, all the way out there. Next slide. A and D are not nearby populations, and in order to get to D, next slide, you have to bypass other nearby populations. So this would be an example of a district that is not compact. Might shock you, but the mayor lived in district, it lives right under the D. And so maybe that's why the district was drawn, to make sure that the mayor, who was a city council member, a rotating mayor, was still had a district. This is an agency that actually, as a result of this redistricting, has gone to a commission to draw their next set of council lines. The public demanded it, and this plan will not be in place in 2022. Let's go to another city next. This is a redistricting abomination, and in fact, this is the city redistricting that probably precipitated the creation of the Fair Maps Act. Next. If you look at population A, look at all the nearby populations it got to get to B. Next. And look at that area where B was. Look at that downtown area that looks like it's pretty grid-like based look in the streets. And in that area, in that circle, you have 4 districts. Again, it won't shock you. There are 4 council members who live in that circle. So that is the kind of plan that that essentially caused and gave strength to advocates for the Fair Maps Act. Next slide. Now I want to show you another city, and I want to show an example of non-compactness, or you could call it non-compactness, that might be necessitated by other factors. And this happens to be one we've done. We did so, full disclosure, this is the city of Davis. Next. This district number 5, somebody could say, well, that doesn't look like I went to the most nearby populations in drawing this district. Next. You could say A and B, they're nearby populations, but Paul, why'd you draw this district to go all the way out to C? And the reality is, next slide, that A to C, this community is called South Davis. Next slide. And those 2 circles are the only ways you can cross Davis. So between those 2 circles is a railway line, the Capitol Corridor train. There's an Amtrak line that goes down the full length. If you were if Connie lived on where the 4 was, and I lived in the purple section near the 4, and we'd have to run across the railroad tracks and risk our lives to see each other without going all the way to one of the 2 circles. So by taking in other factors, the city council rightly chose to draw a district that was less compact, but it also favored other criteria like being contiguous. Next slide. Now, this is a long list. You'll have access to this in the future. You don't have to memorize it or screenshot it, but these are the ranked criteria that you need to follow based on Measure DDD. So first is equal population, like we talked about. Second, Federal Voting Rights Act and any applicable laws, which is basically a nod to like any state requirements. Contiguous, meaning literally and functionally. Preserving neighborhoods. It actually first says neighborhoods and talks about the geographic area. Then communities of interest, which can be this large kind of the art of redistricting part of community input and so on. Then again, neighborhoods. So it mentions it twice just to really put a fine point on it. And in that discussion, it talks about neighborhoods and their language, history, culture, more about the people of the neighborhoods in that one. Geography, topography. Then an interesting one that isn't a part of state law, but is a part of your charter, which is that they're easily understandable by voters. And that's actually a really nice criteria because it says, like, when a voter looks at these lines, does that look to them like their community? Does that look to them like their geographic area, their neighborhoods, and so on? Compactness. Look how far down the line compactness went, right? But it's still a criteria. And that nearby population metric is in your charter as well as the state law. So clearly the people who wrote your charter were also involved in writing the Fair Maps Act. Then you have to follow census blocks. Now, it is a lower criteria, but I don't expect that in our process we would have a need to split census blocks, which is the language. The challenge is that if I have a census block and I say it has 172 people, and I'm using that metric of 172 people to sum up how many people are in that district and say it's equal, or I say that it's 83% Latino, and I'm using that 83% Latino to sum up to a district. If you say, hey, Paul, let's chop that census block in half, now it's anybody's guess what the real population numbers are. we don't have that magical number from the census anymore. We have guesses. So the idea in redistricting is to follow census blocks, and then to not use, then after that, the final criteria is any other criteria that you might have that don't conflict with those prior criteria. So you can have other criteria. You could say, I want all the districts to rhyme, but they're not going to be necessarily a higher order than all these criteria that have been given to you. Next. Now, state and local laws add more criteria to this process. One is you cannot consider the address of any individual, and including any incumbent city council member or any candidates for city council. Let's be clear, you can't draw a district and say, I want to live in this district in a hearing, because that's you as an individual, and you cannot draw districts to advantage or consider any individual person. You cannot draw districts to advantage or disadvantage a political party. You're also required in your process to hold your minimum 9 hearings and to encourage public engagement. And then finally, you are required to do all the posting on your website. And I believe the presentation by John Dobard, he went through some of those requirements and said that you were meeting those requirements based on what he saw on the website. And you're required to maintain those for the next 10 years. There are next some things that you're, there's things that you cannot do. And again, discriminating against a political party, using the address of any individual or candidate or incumbent. And then one last one that doesn't seem at first to make sense, which is that you are not allowed to start drawing lines. The Fair Maps Act requires that we do not produce maps for city council districts until after the census data comes, after the prison population reallocation has been done, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's even a waiting period built in there. So that means that based on the September 30th date for getting the data, we're not going to be in a position to be able to draw council district lines until likely November. There is one caveat to that, and I'll take our lead from other professionals in this space working in California. The Statewide Redistricting Commission could end up drawing what they call visualizations, which are opportunities to see areas and how large they are and so on, but not actual districts. And so we'll leave it to later in the process and you determining what process you want to take as to how we make sure that we're following that part of the law. But that's, again, one of the reasons why when we did this mapping exercise and gave you the login, we didn't give you a login to Long Beach just yet. That will be up, but we would not want you to be drawing actual council district plans yet. Next slide. So I've mentioned census data a bunch of times. Next slide. Census data, we talk about census data like it's this one monolithic thing, and it actually is a number of different things. First off, census data can be broken into 2 file types. There's the geography of census data. And earlier you heard the term Esri shapefiles. A shapefile is a geographic file that outlines an area, and the geography of the census data is similar. Then there's also the data itself. You saw a census block and it said 172 people in it. That count is the data in the census. Then there's point in time data. The data for the decennial census is where people laid their head, when they went to sleep on April 1st, 2020. Then there's also multi-year and averages, other kinds of data that are part of census products that are more estimated data. Next slide. So the Tiger files are the geography of the census. And this little graphic is funny because the LA Times did a Public Records Act request. And in that Public Records Act request, they found this logo that somebody had created for the Tiger files that never got published. But this was at one point, somebody at the census had made this as a logo for the Tiger files. But it is these nested geographies or shapes that are blocks, block groups, and tracks. And if we go to the next slide, I'm going to show these a little bit more in detail. And I'll have this for you in other formats so that if it's hard to see, you'll be able to see in the future. There are census blocks, block groups, and tracks. And they are nested. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that this is an area, Belmont Shores. I just picked any part of Long Beach. It wasn't a bias towards this particular community, but a part that kind of looked visually a little bit interesting. Now, if we go to the next slide, you can see there are all these tiny little census blocks. And each census block, some have 0 people, some have 9 people. I see one with 165 people. I see one with 712 people. These are all, in some cases, actual city blocks. In other cases, they're kind of geographic units that the Census Department has created. There are 710,000 of these in California. The new census is supposed to consolidate a lot of these, and there's only going to be around 500,000. And I have the count for Long Beach, but I'll give it to you in another time. If we go to the next slide, this is the block groups. And as you can see, inside the block group are other blocks. So that block group number is simply summing up, doing the arithmetic of how many people are in each of those blocks. The block groups are important in redistricting because a lot of the data that we talk about actually comes in the block group level. If we go to the next. Finally, the tracts. The tracts are combinations of block groups. So a block might have 0 people, it might have 100 people on average, I'd say. It probably has 25 people. A block group might on average have 1,200 people. And a tract on average might have 7,000 or 9,000 people. And around the state, there are different block groups that are different sizes. In fact, here you have a census tract that only has 117 people. Well, that's a smaller than average census tract, but that is a unit of geography. Next. So those are the geographic elements of the census data. Then there's the data element of the census data. And the most common data sets that we deal with are, this first one is the decennial file. This is your every 10-year census. Now, you might hear it called, this sounds almost like the code for like a fighter jet or something, PL 94-171. That's Public Law 94-171, which is the law that mandates that Congress receive from the Census Department data for the decennial, every 10 years, the decennial data for redistricting. It includes that block geography. And in fact, that block geography we already have. So when you hear about census data being late, that census block geography has been released. It also includes population counts based on April 1st, 2020 to determine the size when we talk about equal population of every district. And the third thing that about this data is something you've already heard, which is that the data was supposed to be released in March 31st by April 1st, but it's been delayed till September 30th. And I think a lot of people have confidence in that September 30th date, but it is important to know that that date has moved around a lot in the last several months. And right now, the Biden administration is having third-party data teams go through the census data to determine whether or not it seems to be high enough quality for publication this year. If problems arise, you will hear from about it from us. Next is, the census data used to be what you would redistrict with. And you do redistrict with the census data, that PL 94-171, but we in California are required for cities and counties in the state to use a modified version of that. The modified version of it will come from Carr McDonald, the statewide database, and it will reallocate prisoner population. Now, this is actually done to allow for more equitable redistricting. And when we went back to those earlier discussions about equal size and equal representation, the idea is that if a district has population that has been incarcerated and it has left the district, that district now is underpopulated and would have to grow in order to make up that population. In redistricting, growing means that you're getting other population in your district, getting other voters in your district, and it's inherently weakening your voting strength. In another district, they get shipped to them 30,000 prisoners. Now their district gets to shrink by 30,000 because of this artificial population that doesn't vote. But now everybody in that district's voting power has been increased. So without the prison reallocation, you're giving more empowerment to voters that have prisons in their district and less empowerment to voters who have incarcerated persons who have left their district, even if they still consider that home. Now, this prisoner reallocation will be something we'll come back to. And with the deadlines and the timeframes we're dealing with, this is something that will be really critical. It is not believed that it's going to have a big impact in terms of, put it another way, it's believed that this will have a big impact in taking population out of prisons. So if you were in Kern County, you might be losing 30,000 people or 40,000 people because they're no longer going to be counted in the prison in your county. But the reallocation all around the state, using the words from Karen McDonald on today's statewide redistricting commission meeting, is that that population is going to be somewhat sprinkled throughout the state. And not every one of those prisoners will be reallocated to a census block throughout the state. If they're state prisoners, but they were incarcerated and their last address was in Arizona, then they just kind of fall off of the redistricting file. It's only when they have an address to which that person lived prior to being arrested. And that's where that data would move to. Next slide. Now, in the second big data set in this process is the American Community Survey, and I've talked about this before. This is important. When I said census block groups are important, one of the reasons why is that a lot of the American Community Survey data is provided at the census block group level. And so it's in its purest form when it's a count at that census block group level. We do a process called disaggregation of moving it down to the blocks so we can use it in redistricting, but those block groups are where it comes in at. Some data comes in at census tract. When I talked about the LGBTQ population, this should be the first redistricting where we will have at the census tract level data from the census on same-sex couples that are from the American Community Survey at the census tract level. The data in the ACS is all estimates. And when you get down to the kind of estimated data we use in redistricting, it's generally a 5-year estimate, meaning that if I say there's 172 people who are Latino citizen voting age population in this census block group, that means that the census has used 5 years worth of surveys in that area. And based on those 5 years worth of data, they believe that there's approximately 172 people in that census block group. The data actually comes with a little margin of error, but that margin of error isn't used traditionally in the calculations. The key data in the census block group level from the American Community Survey is citizen voting age population. When Justin Levitt and Myrna talked about Voting Rights Act issues and the need to draw districts that are majority minority, that 50% Latino, Asian, African American comes from the citizen voting age population metric. Now, some people would say, well, why doesn't it come from voters? Because voters are who vote in elections. The reality is that if we used voters, then in some states where they have real regressive laws that make it hard for certain people to register to vote, or where they do voter purges, you could end up disempowering a community simply because of their bad registration rules. So we utilize this metric, citizen voting age population, to basically be a eligible voter population calculation. Next slide. There will be outside data sources. I mentioned this earlier as well. A couple that would maybe jump out in Long Beach could be environmental data on, asthma rates or transportation issues, pollution, noise. The LGBTQ population that was used by the statewide redistricting commission in 2011, that kind of data. Next slide. And then all of this really is for naught without the public input piece. Even if we tell you this, here's a population of Latinos, you really do need that population, that community of interest to come forward and talk to the commission about who they are, why they're cohesive, what their community of interest is, how it relates to the city, and all those elements. So there's some critical windows of time for this process, and these windows of time are going to be affected by the late census data and really kind of throw it upside down relative to what it was like when Connie did the redistricting in 2011. First off, we have the pre-data period, which means the time between now and September 30th, where we don't even know how big each district's going to be in terms of total population, let alone how that population lays in the city of Long Beach. But it's a great opportunity right now to put up a mapping software like Maptitude or put up other input processes so that people can identify their community. They don't need to know, nobody needs to know what the PL data says about their actual population in a census block to be able to say who their community is, where they go to church, where they recreate, what city services they use, who they are as a community. They don't need that census data, but they do need a method or several methods to send that information to you. After data is released, we will post that data in that mapping software as soon as we physically can. And in that post data, but pre-line drawing process for the commission, that is an opportunity for members of the public to draw their own draft plans. And the law actually just lets them essentially get a head start on you, that they get to start drawing lines before you get to start drawing lines. And then after the lines are drawn, that's another window of time for community input. It's here's the draft maps, or here's 3 draft maps. And it's on a time for people to suggest changes or provide alternate maps. It's a different kind of testimony than you get pre-map. Next. So when do we get this input? So the first way of getting this input, there's going to be multiple ways, but I'm going to outline 3 types. One is at these hearings. It could be your business hearings, like we're having more regularly now, and your outreach hearings that you do in the community or that you design to be focused on certain council districts one at a time, or however you end up doing it. So you are going to be working with the city staff and with us to develop ways for the public to engage and discuss their communities of interest in all 3 of those kind of timeframes at these meetings. Next slide. Another tool, especially for people who maybe that mapping software was a little confusing, is to have a community of interest worksheet. Now, I can send you examples of these, and we've provided some of these examples to the city staff as they help put together a outreach plan that you'll be adopting and working with the city staff on. But we can help put on the website a form that people can fill out. It could be a PDF. It could be a SurveyMonkey, kind of poll looking thing. It can be a web form. And we've worked with multiple jurisdictions to set these up, and we can provide examples. Next slide. The third real prominent way for people to have this input is using online mapping. And we just had the presentation from Caliper with that overview of the process. And we'll continue to have that training, as I discussed to one of the answers from a commissioner earlier this evening. Next slide. But I want to be clear that that online mapping tool is not the only way that the public can actually have input. There are multiple public mapping tools that are available online. Somebody can Google a mapping tool. In some cases, they might be able to find Long Beach in that mapping tool. They might be able to draw a circle and square and draw districts and other things. These are not mapping tools that we manage. So if somebody says, hey, I went to this online mapping tool and they didn't have the neighborhoods, we just kind of throw our hands up and it's like, well, we have that in our Maptitude instance, but we don't control Representable, which is a national, online mapping software. But these are other public tools. Now, if somebody draws lines in those public tools and they want to send us an email like Tracy sent the email with the Esri shapefile or the files, we will be able to ingest that redistricting partners will, and we'll be able to provide that public input with the same map and other visualizations for you to be able to see it, just as if it was provided from your actual tool. So we will work the best we can with these tools, but what's key to understand is we can't be responsible for the data in those tools. Those tools are managed by other folks. Next slide. Now, methods for line drawing. Again, this is just an overview, but there are multiple ways that you can engage in the actual line drawing process. And I think if we do have some questions afterwards, since Connie's here, some people might want to ask her questions about how she believes that line drawing process works best. But in some cases, commissions actually choose not to draw their own lines. What they choose to do is have the public submit draft plans, talk about the plans, say what they like and don't like about the plans, and then essentially elevate one of those as the primary option. In other cases, the members are actively drawing plans. But I think the key thing is to not draw plans until it's time. Next slide. Actually, let's do it again. The three methods that are most common are, like I said earlier, drawing public map, utilizing public maps and starting with one of those and saying, okay, we have to provide draft maps for this process. So we're going to take these three public maps that were submitted and we're going to elevate those to be our draft maps. That's one method that some agencies use. We were really successful in the city of Napa and the city of Davis. In both of those, it was actually maps drawn by the public that got elevated to be the agency's draft maps and then actually got passed. So another method is to have staff produce multiple maps. And with the complexity of the statewide redistricting, I think that's a lot of what Connie might have seen in the statewide redistricting process is staff being assigned to draw maps and then come back to the commission with drafts, and then this commission would kind of debate and come up with changes and so on. And the third is to literally perform a live line drawing. You could say, let's open up the Maptitude. You have me or somebody like Tracy, and you say, okay, start in that part of the map and let's draw a district here. And you can do that live line drawing. And to be clear, these are not mutually exclusive. You could do some combination of these as well. Next. Forward, I think. Okay. The line drawing process doesn't finish with those first draft maps. Community input on these draft plans is really critical. A hearing from the community on these draft maps is going to also be very different than the input that you got when you were just talking about these abstract ideas of communities. The commission will notice that change as they get those maps out. One thing that's important, and I think this is a decision the commission is going to have to make. There's a 7-day posting requirement in your charter for final maps. But in the Fair Maps Act, there's also a 7-day requirement for posting maps to be discussed at any actual meeting. So this is going to be something that you'll have to work with your legal counsel as to how to implement it. But the idea is that the community is empowered if you say, okay, we're going to consider these 4 maps at our next hearing, and those maps are published. The newspaper can say, here's the 4 maps. The public knows what to do. Groups on the outside can start emailing their members. Well, here's the 4 maps the commission's going to talk about. And then they can come to the commission meeting and you can have this discussion about those 4 maps. If you don't follow that rule and you say, hey, we're going to show up at this meeting, and all of a sudden Connie says, hey, I just got a map I created this morning in my kitchen. I want to start discussing this map. You then rob the community of some of that opportunity to understand the maps that are going to be created and actually work within their own community to understand what their response might be. That 7-day posting requirement for maps is intended for the public to be able to have that ability to give you the best kind of input. And next slide, final slide, so you can Relax. The completion of the redistricting process is really being challenged by the late nature of the census. And the reality is that I can't sit here today and tell you what your deadline is. I'd love to hear from your council, but I don't know that your council has a real sense today of being able to see in their legal crystal ball when your deadline is going to be. The measure DDD says that your deadline is 6 months after the release of the decennial census. It actually doesn't make mention of the prisoner reallocation database, so that might effectively be a 5 months after you can start drawing lines. So if the data comes out September 6th, your plans would have to be done March 6th, something like that. Fair Maps Act says that your lines need to be drawn by December 15th. And in fact, the signature in lieu of filing fees begins on December 16th in LA County. So there is a little bit of a deadline there for the election administration. Third, the LA County registrar is going to need the lines in time to be able to run the actual city council election. They told LA City Council in their redistricting commission that that date was December 9th. Now, I don't know if they've updated that, but there is going to be a need to make sure that these lines can be drawn in a time that's effective for the county to be able to implement those city districting lines. So your legal counsel is going to be really critical here in helping guide you as you get to that phase in the fall of this year, into that phase of the process to understand. Now, currently, the statewide redistricting commission's deadline is February 15th. They had a court-imposed December 15th deadline, but then the courts gave them this little add-on. And they said, your deadline's December 15th, but for every day after July 30th, you get an extra day. So they didn't know what they were doing was giving them 2 months extra and moving their actual effective deadline to February 15th. There are a lot of things that might end up being done between now and when we're actually doing the redistricting. We could see a primary be moved from June to July. We could see deadlines being changed at the county registrar's office. We could see legislation being passed to change the rules. We could even see a court step in with multiple cities potentially suing to extend deadlines and the court stepping in and giving some relief there. So the final stage of this redistricting right now is seemingly a little bit up in the air. And with that, I'm done and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I love that Connie's stayed with us. She might have some